Okay. All right. I am Karlie King, and we're at the Creative City Center today, and we're going to learn how to knit today for the Regina Business Downtown's virtual holiday festival. So just a few points on knitting and knitting needles and yarn, that kind of thing before we get started. If you've never knit before and you'd like to get started, usually beginner knitters choose smaller needles, but what I would encourage you to do, or what I would suggest, is to get a little bit larger needles. If the needles are small, it's maybe a little bit more challenging to work out the mechanics at first. So choose larger needles, something that feels super comfortable in your hands. Now I'm just using like kind of a standard yarn size today, but the other thing I would encourage you to do is choose a thicker yarn. The reason, again, working out the mechanics, holding on to the yarn is a little bit easier, but also it's when you're starting out, you want to see progress relatively quickly, and we're going to be working on a little square patch today, something you could do like a washcloth, or make several of them or you could do a long one, make a scarf, or you could, sew them together to make a blanket. So you don't want to be working on your square too long, then you'll get kind of discouraged. So larger needles and a thicker yarn to start with. Okay, so there's going to be 3 phases of this. The first phase is what's called casting on. You want to get the stitches onto your needle so you can start knitting. The second phase I'll go through the basic garter stitch and the steps for that. We'll do a few rows, and then I'll show you how to finish off, take the stitches off the knitting needle. All right, so to start, casting on stitches, you're going to take your yarn, and here's another little trick. A lot of people will unravel their yarn from the outside of the ball, but they're actually wound up so that you can take it out from the inside, then it maintains its shape and you don't look like, a cat in like a few hours having extreme fun with a bunch of yarn. It stays together and it just keeps things neat and organized. So on one end of took it out already, I'll show you what it would have looked like. So at the beginning, it would have looked something like this. So one end will have the yarn that unravels from the inside. So just find that and it'll come out like this, and you're good to go. So you're going to take your yarn and you're going to start with a slip knot. And to make a slip knot, now I'm right-handed, so all my instructions will be for right-handed people. And if you're left-handed, I hope you can switch in your mind. So a slip knot. You're going to take the yarn and you're going to make a circle around your left hand, like so. Then go through the front of the circle, grab the yarn that is leading to the ball, pull it through, and tighten. That's a slip knot. Then the beauty of a slip knot is you're going to put it on your knitting needle and you're going to tighten it up like so. Now this part here is called the tail, and you actually want that relatively long because you could use that later to sew the yarn back into sew the squares together, or you might need to sew it back in. We'll get to that in just a moment. But you don't want a short tail, like you wouldn't want it that long. You do want a substantial length for your tail, like so. Now the downside of that is don't get confused and start knitting with this. You're going to be knitting with the yarn that leads to your ball, okay? This piece here. So you've made your slip knot, you put your first stitch on the needle. Now we're going to cast on. There's several different ways to cast on stitches. This is just one. If you do get into knitting and you want to learn different ways to cast on stitches, you can easily research that on YouTube. This is just one way. So you're going to get the tail out of the way. And then, so for casting on, we're going to cast on, let's say we'll do, let's say 5 stitches, because this is just a demo, just to get you knitting. So I usually say, for casting stitches, piece sign, turn it sideways, wrap it around twice, then take your needle, put it through the top loop, and pull. Now you have 2 stitches. I'll go through that again. So peace sign, turn it sideways, wrap the yarn around twice, so it'll look like this. Take your needle, put it through the top loop, and pull. Peace sign, sideways, wrap it around twice. Take your knitting needle through the top loop and pull. And we'll do one more. Okay, so there are our 5 stitches. And again, we're just practicing. If you get into this and you're like, oh, I really like knitting, and you'd maybe like to knit someone a scarf for Christmas, or a dishcloth or something like that, put 10 on, or 15 or 20, that kind of thing, however wide you'd like your piece. Okay, that's phase 1. You have your stitches on your needle. Now a few little tips for knitting. One, you want to keep the stitches close to the edge without them falling off, which is kind of a bit tricky at first. If you have them down here, it's almost impossible to knit. So keep them near the edge, like so. The other thing, I don't know if you can see this or not. I've got I use my finger to sort of keep the stitches in place like so. And then you can kind of keep the tail out as well. Okay, so we're ready to knit. Now, the mechanics of this, again, like I said, are a little bit tricky at first. So you're going to see me knitting like this. However, if at first it's kind of challenging to learn how to hold 2 needles at once. So if you need to, you can, I've actually seen some people have the knitting needle in between their legs like this while they're starting out. And then you knit like this. So if you need to do that to start, go for it. Do whatever you need to do to secure your left needle. All right. Okay, so there's 4 steps to knitting, and at first just keep repeating them in your mind as you're knitting, and then eventually you won't need to repeat it in your mind. It'll just become automatic. Step number 1, insert the needle into that first stitch, like so. Okay, now this is the tricky part. That's why I said you might need to use your leg. So you got to kind of hold the 2 because you need your right hand. Step 2, take your yarn and wrap it around that needle forward. Step 3, push the yarn down. Step 4, take off the stitch. I'll do that again. So, step 1, insert the needle. Step 2, wrap it around. wrap it forward. Step 3, push it down. Step 4, take it off. So you're always moving the stitches from your left needle to the right. Insert the needle. Wrap it around. Push down. Take it off. Step 1, insert the needle. Step 2, wrap it around. Step 3, push down. Step 4, take it off. Okay, so when you come to the end and you've moved all the stitches from your left needle to your right needle, you move it, start all over again. Move it to your left hand, and then you're going to start all over again. Another good thing, another good practice to get into when you're an intro knitter is to count your stitches at the end of a row to make sure you have. Now we have 5, so you can do a quick count, but if you get into making, like I said, a scarf or a longer, something wider, excuse me, you're gonna maybe have 15, 20 stitches. So one way to check to make sure that you've done it correctly is once you've done, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, we have the same amount of stitches as when we started. We're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to knit a few rows here so you can see what it looks like at the end, and then I'll go through finishing off, taking the stitches off your piece. So I have knit a few rows, and 5 stitches isn't very wide, but this gives you an idea, right? So again, if I wanted to keep going with this little mini scarf, I would just keep knitting, 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 and you just keep knitting till you have the length that you want. But for our purposes here, I've got a few rows so you can see the knitting, and now we're going to go through how to finish it off. Okay, so phase 3. Make sure I've got some yarn here. Okay, so to get these stitches off the needle, you're going to knit 2 stitches just like regular. Okay, so you have 2 stitches on your right needle. Then with your left needle, take the first stitch, insert the left needle into your first stitch, and pull it over the second stitch. Then knit another stitch. So you have 2 stitches on your right needle. Then with your left needle, insert it in the first stitch and pull it over top the second one. And repeat. Make sure you have 2 stitches on your right needle, insert the left into that first stitch and pull it over the second until there's just 1 stitch left. So I'm going to make this big for exaggeration, so you have 1 stitch left, like so. Then cut the yarn, and again you'd want a longer tail on this end too. And then you take that and pull it through your last stitch. And it sort of knots it, just like your initial slip knot. Okay, and there's our little mini rectangle of knitting. So you can imagine if this is larger, then if you had a larger square, if you wanted to make a blanket, make like, you know, however many you want, 12 squares. And then you use you can use the tails to sew them together if you wanted to. Now let's just pretend that this is really long and this is a scarf you wanted to make. These ends, you've got to get a knitting sewing needle. It has a thicker eyelet on it. You put the yarn through that eyelet and you'll sew it back in on the end. Okay, so I got the yarn through this regular sewing needle, but typically you would get what's called like a darning needle, or like I said, a sewing needle specifically for knitting. And it's got a really nice big eyelet, so you don't have to struggle with it too much. Okay, so on our cute little patch of knitting here, at the end, what you can do is just following the pattern of the knitting. You would sew the ends back in just a little bit so they don't unravel. And again, this is kind of cute, but it's a little tricky when it's smaller like this. But again, we're doing this just so you get this will be your first little knitting patch. So once you've sewn it back, like I've sewed it back 2-3 stitches, then you can trim it off, then it won't unravel. So that's done. While I'm doing this, I should mention, okay, so the type of yarn that you get does make a difference. So suppose you do this video and you're thinking, geez, I really like knitting. And one great project to start with, to practice with, is washcloths. You want to get cotton if you're going to do something like washcloths. And actually at the store, at the whatever craft store you go to or wherever you're buying your yarn, they actually have the cotton yarn specifically, they're in the exact amount of length you'd need for yarn to do a washcloth. So just look for that in the yarn section. And it's great, they tell you right on the inside of this label, it'll tell you how many stitches to put on. So they take the guesswork right out of it. If you're doing something like I knit a lot of socks, which is a more advanced project, but then for something like that, you're looking at wool, because wool wicks away moisture, keeps you warm. If you're wanting to do a scarf, I would look for something that's like a blend with, and they have some beautiful, very soft acrylic yarns right now. If it's around your face, or maybe you want to knit someone a little baby blanket, I'd go for the super soft acrylic yarns. They're very nice. Something, if it's against your skin, you want it to be very soft. Okay. Oh, isn't this cute? And here would be your first little patch of knitting with the ends all sewn in. How cute is that?